Greetings, historians from the library. This is the review for AP European Unit 5, which is on the old regime and on overseas trade and colonization, growth of the agricultural and industrial revolution. I'm looking at the review sheet here, fellow historians, and I'm going to take you through it top to bottom here. And the old regime, what was it? The old regime is the name for the period before 1789, which is the French Revolution, and it's a period characterized by what's called the first and second and third estates. It's a period of centuries-old hierarchical relationships, first estate being the church, the second estate being the aristocracy, the nobility, and the third estate for a long time were the peasants and serfs, the farmers at the very bottom, but it did include everyone who was not in the first two estates, and that includes the growing middle class, which is going to be of great consequence during this time period and the centuries to come. The goal of the aristocrats and the peasants is to maintain their privileges against the erosion from somebody above them taking away those privileges. So there's not so much an attitude of revolution and change as it is sort of maintaining the status quo and maintaining your position and your rights vis-a-vis those groups around you. And rights lay in groups. This is the time period of the Enlightenment, and this idea that rights reside in individuals is going to challenge the old notion, but the old notion is pretty much the strongest one here, that your rights lie in the group that you're a part of. If you're a peasant, you might have right to use a field, to use a mill, to use a wine press. If you are in a guild, if you are a clergyman, if you're in a university, your right is because you're part of this other group. And the class that's the most restless is the class that's growing here. The middle class, your bankers, your professionals, your merchants, your businessmen, small industry, traders, these people who have education and growing economic wealth, but who are not at the table of power, they're the ones who are going to be the most ambitious, the most restless. They're the ones who are going to direct the future, the energy of change and eventually revolution in 1789. The greatest concern of both peasants and the urban poor is a good harvest, is getting enough food to eat. Who had most of the wealth? The nobility. The nobility are the small group, maybe somewhere between 1% and 5%, depending on which country, but they own most of the land. But most people are in the third estate, and that third estate, again, is going to have this group, this dynamic group, which is growing, and that's the middle class, also called the bourgeoisie, the urban class, the city dwellers. These people are going to be sort of throwing elbows and looking for greater participation in greater participation in power and in government patronage and privilege and such. The point of the English game laws is to demonstrate the status, the position, the privilege and power of the upper classes against the peasants. How did the English and French nobility differ? A big difference here is, remember, we've been going over the English Civil War here against Charles I and the rise of Parliament and Oliver Cromwell and the Bill of Rights, which follows the Glorious Revolution. What you're seeing here is the growth of the power of Parliament, the growth of the aristocracy in Great Britain, and as they're gaining power, they are agreeing to pay taxes as long as they have a say in it. And this is a huge thing. Power and paying of taxes are going together in Great Britain, where the French nobility, they don't even meet for 175 years before they're called into session at the year of the French Revolution in 1789. And the French nobility are going to have this vast control over their estates, but they are not paying taxes. And they're, remember, at Versailles, they're sort of cozying up to the king, and they're being sort of debased and humiliated. And that comes, their wealth, their power, their freedom from taxes is coming with this lack of power. How do the British Parliament's houses differ? You have a House of Lords and a House of Commons. House of Lords is historically the feudal lords. These are the earls and counts and viscounts and so forth. These are the people who've got these huge estates, like you may be seeing the BBC production Downton Abbey. The House of Commons are the commoners, the people who are not lords. But keep in mind here, at this time period we're looking at, these are the wealthy. Many of them are the children of lords who aren't, inheriting the land. And remember, primogeniture is this notion that the eldest son inherits the land. So the House of Commons are your bankers, your traders, your merchants, your people who've got position and power in the cities and the urban areas, as well as a substantial number of the lesser sons of the upper classes. And a dowry, this is that capital that a woman brings into marriage, a payment basically to her husband when she enters into a marriage contract. French taxes, just be familiar with some of these terms here. The taille is a tax on land. This is where most of the tax money is coming from. Banalities are these taxes on they're sort of the feudal rents that are left over. You might pay to use an olive press and a wine press. You might pay to use an oven. You might pay to grind your grain. These payments you use for things which are the right of the aristocrat to give you. The corvée is a labor tax, a few days a month. On average, you're working working on a road, working on draining ditches. You might be working on repairing a bridge, just whatever the work that needs to be done in and around the aristocrat's estate. Women, what was the work of most women? Most women are assisting in household production, and if your husband's a farmer, you're working on the farm, and you're doing whatever you think that farmers are doing. You might be helping plow, you might be helping plant, you might be helping hoe weeds out of the garden, you might be feeding the chickens and milking the cows and sewing cloth and whatever you're doing in that household. If you are the wife of an artisan and your husband's a carpenter or he's a cooper, a cobbler, a weaver, a tailor, a baker, you're involved in that business. Everyone is involved in production. If you don't make it, you're not eating or you're not earning the money to buy food. And this will change here with the growth of the Industrial Revolution. Women will be increasingly left at home while the man goes off to work. And you have this division where the home increasingly becomes a place of consumption and not production. And the means of production, the tools, become machines, and they become outside the home. The husband's going to go become a wage laborer, and he's going to bring money back to the home for the woman to spend. That's kind of more a simplistic generalization, but the production is going to leave the home over time, increasingly so. And the home then becomes a place. Ideally, the ideal home is a middle-class woman who does not have to work, who raises the children to be godly, to be patriotic. And in the United States, we called it the Republican motherhood, that you're teaching children to be little Republicans with a small r, believers in democracy and freedom. But the woman becomes the woman who teaches literacy and morality. And again, that's the ideal. Many, many, many women are still on the farm. Many women are poor. Some women are working in the mills. So there's this contradiction between what is the ideal and what is actually happening. For women, birthing was very dangerous. This time period we're looking at, sort of the 1700s, it's not uncommon for a woman to die during giving birth. Education. Lower class women don't have a lot of education. Protestant women are learning how to read because teaching children the Bible is important, but education is pretty much the reservation of the upper classes. And again, remember, this comes all the way back to the Renaissance. If you are a noble, if you're an aristocrat, you want your wife to make you look good. So she should know how to sing, she should know how to play an instrument, she should know some poetry, she should be literate, she should be, she's sort of a prop in showing the sophistication of your household. But the masses of women didn't have much in the way of education. And upon marriage, you lost you brought a dowry. What you earned was your husband's. And of course, women are limited in many areas. They don't have access to the professions. They don't have access to the guilds. Women don't have access to universities. And women are, as the time moves into the Industrial Revolution, women, if they're working at all, are working as unequally paid, untrained wage labor. More often women would be domestics, and your book makes a big deal of the very poorest women are going to be begging, and there's going to be quite a bit of prostitution in the urban areas as they grow. Children during this time period, children are the idea of childhood as we know it, where basically you just kind of fool around and have a carefree childhood and go to school for what now would be essentially 12 years plus. This is not unknown. Most children are working from the time that you can, figure things out and walk. You are, doing chores on the farm, and you might be doing some help in your father's store business if you're living in a town. Women are working, children are working to make enough money to buy food. To, what you produce is what you have. The relationship between the agricultural and the Industrial Revolution. The agricultural revolution is essential to free people up from having to work on the farm. You need more hands to work in factories. And there will be a question on the test about what do we mean by the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution is the ability of farms to grow more food with less people, so you can feed people in the growing cities. And then during the agricultural revolution, you have several innovations. You have the seed drill. Famously, Jethro Tull's seed drill allows a more systematic planting of the kernels in the soil in a way that will provide more crops per acre versus the old method of just sowing your seed on the ground, which might be blown away, which might be dried up, which might be eaten by birds. You have the use of an iron plow replacing a wooden plow. You have the enclosure movement, which is kicking people off land. You have the three-field system replacing the fallow field system, where you're leaving that third of the land fallow to sort of naturally compost. And the three-field system allows the use of plants like clover, like turnips, beans, and things which will affix nitrogen in the soil, allows a continuous productivity in the soil where previously it had been where it lay fallow. The introduction of new crops is important, in particular potatoes and corn from the Americas. You have the Dutch across the channel who are reclaiming land from the sea. They're building dikes, and they have these windmills which are pumping the water out of this reclaimed land. So you have this very active making greater efficiency in farming. And this is necessary, again, to free people up so that they can go off to work. Now, this is not all voluntary. The enclosure movement, remember, this is basically the wealthy and the powerful kicking the poor off of land, which for who knows how many centuries perhaps, they had the right to pasture their cows and their sheep and their goats and whatever. These people are forced into the cities, and many of them go sort of begging and poor and impoverished and unwillingly, essentially. But this is what is going to be sort of shaking up the social structure of Europe. And again, what the enclosure movement is this fencing of previously common land. The negative is you lose use of the land and you become impoverished. The positive consequences is this workforce, which is going to push forward the Industrial Revolution, which in itself will be producing more goods at cheaper cost, which is going to allow greater consumption because there's greater production. The domestic system is also called the putting out system, and that is the system. It's the pre-industrial system for making textiles, where in the off months, mostly women on the farms would be given, the job of producing textile, and this is going to be replaced by all these inventions of the water frame and the spinning jenny and these devices for increasing textile production. And the part of Europe that had no agricultural revolution is Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, you can simply flog the peasants, make them work harder, make them work longer. You don't have the efficiency you have in places like England and the Low Countries and the Netherlands. The relationship between the commercial revolution and the industrial revolution. The commercial revolution is the term that we give to the time of greater growth of trade, and particularly overseas trade. This precedes industry. It doesn't precede urbanization. What happens with exploration, discovery, and settlement and the growth of trading empires, particularly by the British and the French, the Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese, is you have money pouring into these coastal cities, the growth of towns, and you have an increase of banking, an increase of capital. And it's this capital which will help fund the Industrial Revolution. And Britain's at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution because of this previous overseas trade. England is a place of growth of of roads and canals. England has a stable government. It has a stable court system which will uphold the sanctity of contracts. England has plenty of coal, plenty of iron, has social mobility, this growing middle class, and again, free trade. Britain has all these things sort of interlocking, making it a relatively prosperous place at the forefront compared to other places in Europe. Mercantilism is the notion that you should have a favorable balance of trade, which means more money should be coming in than should be going out in payment to other countries. You don't want to lose your gold and silver. To this end, it's good to have colonies where the colonies will buy your stuff and they'll give you the raw goods that you need to produce. And you have competition for colonies because it's colonies that will presumably make you wealthy. As far as the Jewish population of Europe, most Jews are in Eastern Europe and what we would call Poland and Russia, and a pogrom is an attack on a Jewish community out of sort of religious intolerance and hatred and fear of Jews for various reasons. Plantation labor in the Americas, you have the growth in English and Spanish and Portuguese Americas, both North and South America. You have the growth of plantations growing these export crops, things such as tobacco and sugar and indigo, and later on cotton, which is going to grow very much so after the 1793 cotton gin by Eli Whitney in the Americas. But the Indians are going to die off because of disease. They're going to be more likely to escape into the interior. And there's going to be a need, quote unquote, and the need is there's not this economic determinism that there's lack of labor, so you have to go kidnap Africans. This is a decision of white Europeans. But because of the need for labor, the shortcut here to actually, doing the work yourself is to kidnap black Africans and bring them over. And approximately, the numbers are a little bit fluid here, but something like 10 million Africans will be kidnapped and forcibly brought over in what's called the Middle Passage. The season of adjustment in the Americas is called seasoning. And the triangular trade is the nickname given for this trade, particularly in North America, and that's the bringing slaves over to the Caribbean, which is where about 90% of the slaves are going to grow sugar in either South America or the Caribbean. When we think of American slavery, that's 10% or less of the total that are coming over. Anyhow, these slaves are coming to grow sugar in the Caribbean, and the sugar and the molasses is coming up to New England, being turned into rum, which is going back to Africa to buy slaves. And that's kind of the basic idea. Don't be confused. If you see a map or something that shows 4 legs, maybe one leg going to England to buy shackles or chains to chain these slaves, this is the same idea, this idea of international trade between the old and the new world. The American Revolution, your book touches very briefly on this, causes politically. The American colonists are believing that they should not be taxed without representation. If you remember your APUSH, your American history, remember there's this long period of salutary neglect where England has got their civil war going on, and England's got all these wars against France, and the Americans over several centuries here are, they're settling in 1607 in Jamestown, 1620 up in Massachusetts, and when the French were finally defeated in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War, during this time period, the Americans are worshiping freely, religiously. They're setting up their own legislatures. Think of the House of Burgesses down there in 1619 in Virginia. The Americans are trading with whom they want. They're violating mercantilism. They're violating the English Navigation Acts. What happens here at the end of this war, of the French and Indian War, is the Brits are going to crack down, try to collect their taxes, help pay for the empty treasury after fighting these long wars against the French. And the Americans are going to rebel. They're going to feel politically this is unjust because they're not voting on these taxes. Economically, they're getting hammered with all these Stamp Act and the Townshend taxes and the Tea Act, the Tea Tax. And intellectually, what's pushing this are these Enlightenment ideas, particularly from John Locke, this idea that we're born with natural rights, that we're born free, and we create governments voluntarily to protect our rights, and these governments are provisional, they're temporary, they are conditional on protecting our rights, and that we are free, in fact, have a duty to overthrow them, to change them. And these ideas are openly cribbed and copied by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. So these ideas of political freedom are going to cross from England over to America. These are all English ideas that we're taking because the Americans are basically transplanted English over in North America across the Atlantic. The wars in the period from 1648 to 1793, you should know a little bit about these wars. We've talked about some of them previously. The War of Spanish Succession, when the King of Spain dies in 1701, both the Austrians and the French have a plausible claim to the throne through various bloodlines, and war is waged against France to keep a super Bourbon state from happening. And the war ends with the deal that there will be a Bourbon French grandson on the throne in Spain, but there will not be a united kingdom of France and Spain. These will be two separate governments, two separate countries. So the War of Spanish Succession was over fear of growing French power, with the French agreeing not to claim Spain, even though they get to put a Bourbon on the throne in Spain. That war lasts from 1701 to 1714. The War of Austrian Succession. The War of Austrian Succession is a war pretty much caused by the Prussians. When the Austrian emperor dies without a son and Maria Theresa takes the throne, Prussia will use this as a pretext to seize Silesia, which is one of the independent, mineral-rich, wealthy German states. And this will plunge Europe into war, basically over fear of the growing power of Prussia. And once the war ends, essentially, Prussian power is growing at the expense of Austria. Austria is going to slowly be eclipsed by the Prussians, who are going to be expanding through marriage and through warfare, like the seizure of Silesia. As a side note here, you do have the War of Jenkins' Ear, which is a war by the Brits against the Spanish in the Caribbean for the right to sell slaves. And this follows the capture of a British captain, Mr. Jenkins, who had his ear cut off for violating Spanish mercantilism, for him selling Spain in their trade zone. And this is a war that is at the very tail end here of the War of Austrian Succession, and really part of it. The 7 Years' War is going to actually start in North America with the American English attacking the French in disputed area of western Pennsylvania. Who's going to own this area, sort of the Ohio River Valley area of Pennsylvania, Ohio? Will it be the French Canadians, the Quebecois, or will it be the English? And that war, that outbreak in North America, is going to lead to a broader war in Europe between the French and the English. And Prussia is going to preemptively strike and try to grab Saxony, one of the German states. And this is going to bring Prussia into war with Austria. And Prussia is going to join with England and a lot of countries. What's interesting here is Prussia is going to have a lot of countries fighting it. You're going to have the French, the Austrians, at one time the Russians, and the Swedes, all against the Prussians, who at the end of the war, amazingly, for various reasons, will remain standing and independent. And even though they're a small country, they are going to keep Silesia, and it's going to show the endurance of Prussia, and it's going to show ultimately the continuing growing weakness of Austria. But the 7 Years' War, from an American-English point of view, is important because it removes the English from French Canada, and this becomes controlled by the English ever after. And of course, it's this war which is going to be a huge English victory, and the irony is the exchequer, the treasury, is going to be bare, and they're going to dump these taxes on the Americans, and they're going to try to enforce them, leading to the American Revolution, which is between, if you include Lexington Concord, between 1775 and 1783. And just keep in mind, there are two treaties of Paris. One ends the 7 Years' War, which is also called the French and Indian War, and there is a Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution. One's dated 1763, 1783, and if the context would be how you would tell these two treaties of Paris apart. Well, there you have it. That's the review. If you have any questions, find me before your test. Signing off from the library.